Does that sound good to you, Allison?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for It Takes a Village to Raise a Chick. It's a conversation with Allisyn-Marie Gillet, State Ornithologist with Indiana DNR. My name is Kate Hamill and I'm Sycamore Land Trust's Communications Director. So this conversation is part of our Conservation Conversation lecture series with local experts and authors who inspire us to get involved in protecting nature. Our last conversation, Discover the Awe of Birdwatching, with ornithologist and author John C. Robinson, is now available at sycamorelandtrust.com/conversations. So if you're interested in watching it, it was a really wonderful program. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to Sycamore and then turn this over to Allison. So Sycamore Land Trust is a nonprofit conservation organization which was founded in 1990. Our service area includes 26 counties in southern Indiana, and we currently protect 126 properties on totaling 10,515 acres. Our mission is to preserve, our mission is, one moment, I lost it. Our mission is to preserve the beauty, health, and diversity of southern Indiana's natural landscapes through strategic land conservation and environmental education. Sycamore was founded in 1990 and is proud to be accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. We maintain over 30 miles of public hiking trails on 13 public nature reserves in southern Indiana, including one of the longest boardwalks in the Midwest at Bean Blossom Bottoms Nature Preserve. Our work is powered by over 1,300 members and more than 350 volunteers. Sycamore protects land over 10,515 acres of land in southern Indiana on more than 50 nature preserves. This is an aerial photo of Bean Blossom Bottoms Nature Preserve, which is in our Bean Blossom Creek Conservation Area north of Bloomington. This is a priority area for Sycamore, where we are protecting over 2,000 acres of wetlands and other critical habitat along Bean Blossom Creek. I love this picture. We also restore habitat to preserve biodiversity. Our land stewardship efforts include planting thousands of trees, maintaining wildlife habitat, and annual efforts to reverse the spread of invasive plants. This is a photo of staff and volunteers collecting milkweed and ironweed seeds on one of our nature preserves in the Bean Blossom Creek Conservation Area. We used these seeds in our native plant nursery this year to grow hardy native plants for habitat restoration projects in this priority conservation area. In addition to protecting land and restoring habitat, an important part of Sycamore's mission is to connect people with nature. One way we do this is by maintaining over 30 miles of free public hiking trails on 13 of our public nature preserves. We also connect people to nature through our environmental education program, which provides free outdoor education for local schools and community groups. And this program has served over 35,000 people since it was founded in 2005. And I really love this picture too. This is a Mama Virginia possum with her babies on her back, which was spotted on the trail this summer by a group of hikers from Girls Incorporated, Girls Inc., which they were on a guided hike with Mary Wells, our education director at Bean Blossom Bottoms, and spotted this family. So if you have any questions about Sycamore Land Trust and our work, please get in touch with us. You can also visit Sycamore Land Trust /explore to request us to be mailed a free nature preserve guide with maps of our hiking trails. And now I am very pleased to introduce Allisyn-Marie Gillet, State Ornithologist with Indiana DNR. Once Alli begins her presentation, you can all feel free to type your questions in the comments in the chat here on Zoom, and a question and answer session will follow the presentation, and we'll include as many of the questions in that as we can. So Allisyn-Marie Gillet is a conservation biology professional with 15 years of education and experience in research involving extensive handling of wild birds. As state ornithologist at Indiana DNR for the past 7 years, her responsibilities include eagles, whooping cranes, songbirds, migratory birds, owls, barn owls, nest boxes, and nesting box cameras. So Alli, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us. Alli's presentation today is titled "It Takes a Village to Raise a Chick." And in this picture, she's holding a falcon chick. I assume that you saved from a rooftop. I'd really like to hear that story if you have time for that.
Oh, absolutely.
And great. And Alli, I'll turn this over to you now. And feel free to share your screen.
Sure. So just to help explain that photo, one of our efforts specifically is to ban peregrine falcon chicks. So that is part of our conservation program after the restoration of peregrine falcon species in Indiana. We've been wanting to be able to better monitor their productivity over time and see how many of those chicks actually end up surviving, because a lot of them, often in these urban environments where they're raised, we have a whole bunch of nest boxes on buildings. They don't make it too well just because there are a lot of threats, like running into other buildings or getting hit by cars and things like that. So we ban them to better understand, which ones are surviving, how many are surviving, and whether the population is able to continue producing at a rate that will maintain it and hopefully grow that population. So that's what that picture is all about. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, does that look okay to everybody? Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. All right, so I'll get started. I just want to introduce myself. Thank you for that excellent background. Just to reiterate, I'm the state ornithologist for the Indiana DNR. Sometimes people are like, what is the DNR? It's the Department of Natural Resources. It is our state agency that's dedicated to conserving our wildlife and as well as our natural places. And so I'm here to specifically discuss non-game bird conservation in Indiana and to focus more on those big partnerships that are necessary to make conservation work in the state, because birds move everywhere. That's what they do. And you can't just conserve birds in the place that you focus on, because you're missing out on a lot of the other parts of their life cycle. So in order to protect a bird, you need to protect that bird through its whole entire life, whether it migrates to Indiana to breed here and then goes all the way back to Central America, South America to go in winter. We need to be able to protect all those locations. And so I specifically named this talk, "It Takes a Village to Raise a Chick," because it truly does. It takes a lot of effort because birds move all over the place. And even though we see the birds in our backyards that we say are our birds, they're actually everybody's birds shared among multiple different jurisdictions, different states, different countries. And then surprisingly, when you really take a deeper dive into understanding birds, a very small percentage of time is actually spent breeding. So like majority of their time is actually on the wintering grounds when they're not here. So it's good to know that, and that we need to also focus our efforts there as well. So today I'll be talking about all the efforts that are involved in being able to preserve the species, focusing specifically on the loggerhead shrikes and this new effort that the Indiana DNR has recently gotten involved with, which is Motus. It's a wildlife tracking network. So just to give you a little bit of background about what the program does, my program, which is the non-game bird program, I'm specifically responsible for counting and monitoring birds that there's little known about them or that are declining, so that we can learn more about them and perhaps identify the threats that they're facing that are causing their declines. And when we identify those threats, we can actually address them, mitigate them, and hopefully stabilize the population to then hopefully increase their abundance over time. Just halt those declines and enhance those populations. Because ultimately my goal is to maintain the biodiversity, all the different wildlife bird species in the state, while also making sure that we are taking care of the ones that are declining and helping them have a better opportunity for improving in the future. So the specific bird species that I focus on include some of those really popular bird species, such as the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle, and barn owls, which are big raptors, and they're very charismatic, and they're super cool because they're super fast and they're excellent fluffy killers. And so I deal with them, but I also deal with those lesser known species like the least tern. So if you look at the photo to the right and in the middle, that's a least tern feeding its mate. We use trail cameras to get that footage and get those really intimate views into their lives, which is exciting. And then we also have like other lesser known species that we work on, like eastern meadowlarks, as well as marsh birds, those birds that people don't normally focus on since they're not as charismatic. And the priorities of the program are specifically to survey for those listed species so that we can get an idea as to whether the species occurs in Indiana, where it occurs in Indiana, how abundant the population is, and population trends, how the population is faring over time, whether it's declining or staying status quo, staying the same. And we're particularly interested in whether the species, again, is declining so that we can either list them and then get money to devote to their conservation later on. I also conduct research to address the needs and threats to these species. And then I develop and implement conservation strategies to mitigate those population declines, such as things like managing habitat for the species, so that, for example, like building nest boxes so that they have safe places to nest. If those safe places are not, or rather no longer available in the environment that we currently have, which is more of a human-dominated environment. So we can provide those necessary things for them to breed and reproduce. And specifically, the non-game program is divided up into 13 major projects that are mainly delineated by species, and I'll talk about them a little bit. So in the past, people have been, or rather have known this program as being mainly involved in a lot of raptor work, like I mentioned, bald eagles, peregrine falcons, osprey, and barn owls. And so for specifically the bald eagle, osprey, and peregrine falcon, we still do some work with them, but most of our efforts have actually shifted away from those species because much of the work has been done and we have declared them as restored. So my program has been kind of shifting our focus onto species that I would consider as more identified as declining nationwide and in great need of conservation work, such as those that are associated with grasslands and wetlands. Grasslands are suffering a lot. There are a lot of grassland losses, just like these large, contiguous areas of grasslands that some species of birds really, really need. They need big expanses of grasslands with very few trees around, just because trees provide purchase for predators, but we don't have that anymore. And then when it comes to wetlands, we also are losing our really valuable and shallow wetlands that, for example, marsh birds use. So we have actually 6 species that are listed that are marsh bird species on our endangered species list. So a lot of the focus has been shifting away to not raptors, but more towards grassland bird species as well as wetland bird species. And the work that we do is really kind of variable across the year. A lot of the work is the thing that I really love about this job, is that it's constantly changing throughout the year. So in fall, we have a sandhill crane count where we count migrating cranes. Indiana is one of the best places to see cranes from the eastern migratory population. There's a major stopover site at Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area where you can just see thousands of cranes in a day. It's wonderful. I highly recommend going there. It's kind of like this big cacophony of sandhill cranes all just filling the air and then all coming down into this roost. And it's really beautiful at sunset or sunrise because of the silhouettes. This can be rather like breathtaking, so I highly recommend that. Another thing that we do is do wintering loggerhead shrike surveys. I'll talk more about those loggerhead shrike surveys a little bit later in my talk. And then in the winter, we do some work where we install barn owl nest boxes, as well as check those barn owl nest boxes for occupancy, or rather whether there were breeding birds, breeding barn owls in the box, actually raising chicks. And so far, those occur every 5 years. And the reason why we don't do it every year is because we have more than 350 boxes throughout the state that we've installed, and that's a lot of work. So I had to dedicate a specific person to checking all those barn owl boxes, in addition to adding more boxes, because barns are constantly changing and falling down and being built up and changed into metal barn owl or barns. And so we're constantly just trying to keep up with them. But our barn owl population is doing it since doubled since our last comprehensive survey. Other things that we do is capture and tag whooping cranes. We've been doing a lot of work with the International Crane Foundation. That's one of our most fun projects because we get to celebrate Halloween a little bit out of date and dress up in crane costumes. So that's one of our tactics to be able to attract cranes to us so that they can be captured and we can hold them and replace their bands around their legs, as well as the transmitters that they hold on their bands. So there are satellite transmitters that you can actually attach to a crane by just putting it on a huge band, because they're huge birds. They stand 5 feet tall. And that helps us better track each individual. And if you don't know much about whooping cranes are only about 80 individuals now in the eastern population. A lot of them come through Indiana, which is quite a special treat just because there's just so few in the East. In the world, there are around 800 individuals, so they're extremely rare. And the wild individuals, I think they're around 300 and something, 300 or so in the West that are have their own migratory route. So it's quite, I'd say, a special once in a lifetime experience to actually see and encounter a whooping crane because they're just so rare. But we get them regularly wintering here. So October, November, December, January, and February is when they're around here. And that's when we put all of our efforts towards capturing them so that we can put those transmitters on. So that can help the International Crane Foundation, our partner, to be able to go and figure out where their nests are and, you know, use all the tools and methods that they've employed in the past to enhance their production or how many chicks that they raise. So that's an aside, but I get to have an aside about every single project that we have and pick up a whole lecture with each aside. Anyways, so another part in spring, it's our busy season. We have 5 surveys that we conduct. It's peregrine falcon surveys, where we check on nest boxes and see whether their peregrine falcons are breeding successfully. We ban peregrine falcon chicks as well. And then we do shorebird surveys to see whether there's a specific location, Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife area, that attracts, it's a specific public property that maintains water levels for water birds. And so we want to see whether that's actually working or not, how many birds it's attracting and providing habitat for. Then we have a marsh bird survey, similar idea to the shorebird survey, just a little bit more comprehensive, just involves a more standardized protocol. And then a colonial waterbird count where we go and check how many colonial waterbirds are nesting at a big industrial site. Surprisingly, they love industrial sites. That's one of the biggest surprises that I've ever had in my career, was that a lot of birds love to hang out on power plant properties. I don't know why, but figured out later I could talk a lot about that. They're not in these pristine areas that you would expect. So like our least terns are often on power plant properties. And I think it's just because of their cooling ponds, they're attracted to those large cooling lakes that provide lots of fish and heat when you're cold. So fun fact, I'd say. And then the least turn work. The photo that I have in the lower right, or the photo, let's see, the next one that I have in the lower right hand corner is one of our trail cams showing a coyote eating one of the least turn eggs. So we use, in the summer, we do a lot of just making sure that our breeding populations of these state listed species are doing well. And one of those efforts is to put trail cameras on nests at these location on least turn nests to see if there are predators eating those nests. And this is our coyote that's doing so, and everybody's got to eat, so that's good. But we just need to figure out ways to prevent the coyotes from getting into the colony. But I really specifically like this photo because you can see that the coyote is very gently picking up the egg with his mouth instead of just like going crazy over it. And I was just very impressed by how gentle that coyote was when it was doing that. I was like, oh, okay, I guess he's handling the egg with care right before he gobbles it down. I thought that was funny. And then we work on, again, banding peregrine falcons. Here's to the left the photos of my predecessor and myself banding some falcons. We get a lot of news media like very interested in this because people love raptors, but which is great. So it helps us get more interest in non-game bird work. And then the top photo is of least turns again feeding each other. So let's see. We have 13 separate projects, and what comprises the non-game program to actually conduct all of those projects throughout the year is not only myself, but my assistant, Amy Kearns, a handful of field technicians that I hire every year, and contractors, and lots of volunteers. We really depend on our volunteers to make this work possible. And none of this could actually be possible without the help from that group of people, plus our partners, which is exactly why I named this talk, It Takes a Village to Raise a Chick, because it really does. It takes a lot of people to get together, to work collectively for a common goal. And I honestly think that is the way of the future of conservation. I don't think it's possible to continue working within a bubble because so much is changing, and a lot of especially with birds, they move all over the place. And so you gotta be in the places where they're going, or you have to conserve them wherever they go. That means you have to be able to work with other people that are in those locations. So right now, what I'm gonna do is do a deeper dive into the loggerhead shrike, Shrubs for Shrikes program, and then we'll talk about Motus. So in case you don't know what a loggerhead shrike is, they are they're a songbird, and they're called loggerhead shrikes because of their comparatively large heads. Their loggerhead, it's much bigger than a head, or their heads are bigger comparative to the size of their bodies. And so they're a unique species of songbirds in that they hunt like a bird of prey. So even though they're about the size, I want to say, of a mockingbird, they act like a raptor. They have the behavioral characteristics of a fierce raptor. They mainly eat invertebrates, and they are able to use their powerful bill to take invertebrates plus vertebrate items like mice and other birds. We've had heads of cardinals impaled on barbed wire, as well as house sparrows, all kinds of stuff. So they can take prey items equal to their size, like mice, frogs, snakes, and other songbirds. And however, they lack talons, which makes it difficult for them to be able to actually pick apart their prey. And so as a result, the way that they compensate for the lack of their talons is by anchoring their prey, which we call larders, onto sharp objects, oftentimes barbed wire. So they'll hang up their prey on barbed wire and then use that as an anchor and use their strong bill to tear off the pieces of flesh so that they could eat it and feed it to their young. This is actually the species, or this is the behavior that gives them the name of butcher bird. Hence why I put that. This is a Herald Times article feature by Carol Kugler that was like, the butcher bird, coolest bird ever, which I totally agree. They earn their name for a reason. So they actually, in addition to their ability, that specific behavior to anchor their prey on sharp objects, they have this thing called a tomial tooth, which is what's shown by that arrow. I don't know, can you see my little, all right, the cursor. Right here, you can see this little notch in their bill. That's a tomial tooth. And that gives them the ability to sever the vertebrae of their prey. That's really what it does. Peregrine falcons have it, a bunch of raptors have it. And so they also have adapted that trait. And yeah, it makes it just a lot more efficient of a way to kill any of their vertebrate prey. And the notch is there to just be like kind of, it meets with another part of the notch to just meet up kind of like a lock and a key, where they meet perfectly together. And so the type of habitats that the type of habitats that loggerhead shrikes really like are typically really open fields around livestock. They have really keen eyesight, and they use things like telephone poles, tree branches, and fences as perches to locate prey. And then what they do, they like to use those short perches to be able to spy on their prey and then pounce on it, if you will. And then they'll hit their prey, stun it, and then carry the prey off, and then impale their prey onto whatever sharp object that they can find. Oftentimes, like, we have touted them as great animals for insect, like invasive insect control, or control of garden pests, just because they take care of like things like the grasshoppers and beetles and things like that that might eat at, you know, the garden that you have around your house that you want to grow, you know, peppers and things like that. So they also do hang up fish, or they also do hang up frogs and voles in the winter, as well as cardinals and house sparrows. So that's so far what we've seen. And the type of habitat that they prefer is open country with short vegetation, such as pastures with what we call fence rows, which are just the fences along the edges of these fields that are enclosing the livestock. Also old orchards, mowed roadsides, and sometimes it depends on where they are, but there are urban shrikes that occupy cemeteries, golf courses, the backs of perhaps a shopping mall. They're a really interesting species because we haven't been able to figure out what they really want. So we've been trying to get at that, but it seems like there are quote unquote cultural differences between these shrikes. So shrikes in like Florida like to hang out in the urban areas, and they like to eat. There's a paper on a bacon larder. A shrike went into a dumpster, pulled out bacon, and wrapped it around a twig. And then it was a bacon larder that's how they were getting their food. And they were just hanging out in one of the, those isolated trees in the middle of a shopping mall. So, but our shrikes in Indiana specifically like this type of habitat. They like open areas with short grass, specifically pastures. Typically, they want to have isolated trees to nest in, such as cedar trees or large isolated oaks in the middle of farm fields, some of those huge old oaks that you'll see on people's farms. And they prefer barbed wire because that provides them locations to impale their prey, perching sites to be able to spy their prey from, as well as sometimes, this is not obligatory, but grazing animals, because they actually often do line their nests with their fur. So I've seen some really beautiful nests that look like a wonderful bed to be raised in. Sheep fur just lining the whole thing. And you're just like, this is really soft. And it looks like probably it'd be the most expensive bed you could find in the store. But they make it for themselves. So overall, just to summarize, they like flat open areas with scattered trees and shrubs and plenty of areas to perch and impale prey. And oftentimes we end up seeing them on Amish farmland, which is fascinating. Amish and Mennonite farmland. And I think it's because they have the livestock, they have all these elements. They have livestock, the isolated trees, as well as a diversity of bugs to prey upon, because they don't do big agriculture. And so they often just end up being found in areas associated with Amish and Mennonite people. So to give you a better idea, so why are we really focusing on the species? The species has declined a lot since the early 1800s. So the species was actually once widespread and common throughout its entire range, especially in that late 1800s when agricultural practices created really ideal habitat for them, such as like small fields and pastures, as well as hay meadows, shrubby fence rows, and these isolated clumps of trees. However, over time since then, we've seen this increased almost like an industrialization of farming, ag practices, where it's become more intensified, and there's instead a monoculture of crops. So you only see corn or soy rather than a large diversity of crops within a smaller space. And as a result, suitable habitat for loggerhead shrikes have really declined. We do a survey, the whole country actually does a survey called the North American Breeding Bird Survey that is done annually since 1966. And I have data from 1966 to 2013, and data show that across the whole country, loggerhead shrikes have declined 3.2% per year. So imagine the human population losing 3.2% of its people per year. That's a lot. If you look at this map, all the red in the map represents the decline in the number of breeding shrikes that is below 1.5% per year. So that's a lot. Most of this map is red. That means it's all mostly declining. Specifically in Indiana, there is a 4.99% decline per year. And that's with what we call high credibility, which means the data are, you can trust those data. There's enough data to be able to determine that those trends are actually real. And then we also do this thing specifically in the state. This is a statewide effort where we've conducted these breeding bird atlases, which occurred first in, I want to say 1985 to 1990. We did our first one, and then we had another one that was done in 2006 to 2011, or 2005 to 2011, and we're able to compare these really comprehensive surveys of all the breeding bird species in the state against each other to see how have they been changing over time. How have these population fared, meaning have they declined? Has their distribution shrunk over time, or are they expanding? And so these breeding bird atlases, the first one that was ever done was, again, in the late 80s, had 35 blocks. This is just how we measure, how we divide up the state instead of like being able to survey the whole entire state, every little bit of it. We divide up we divide it up into blocks to just randomly sample locations, because it would take way too much effort to be able to do the whole entire state. It's just not possible. So we had 35 of these blocks that were sampled that actually had some evidence of nesting shrikes. And then by the second atlas, there are only 3. And the overall decline that occurred was about 4.9% of their, I would say, not their population, because this just looks for present absence, it's of their distribution overall, meaning like how far do these birds range within the state. That distribution or range, it really contracted over time. Again, 4.9% overall. So overall, it's harder to find breeding shrikes today than it was in the past. That just tells us likely they're facing declines. And so with all these data from the Breeding Bird Survey, as well as the Breeding Bird Atlas, we are able to get at that decline is likely universal, it's likely real. And so we need to do something about that. Now, fewer than 10 breeding territories are found now in Indiana each year. We actually used to have 100 back in the 80s. That changed to around 50 in the 90s, and now we're down to 10 in the entire state of Indiana, which is really unfortunate. That's how I see it. It's just very, it's something that's really urgent and needs to be done to better rectify it, just because they could easily become extirpated from the state, meaning locally extinct in the state and no longer breeding here, which would, to me, that would be a huge loss, because that's a loss of biodiversity and that's a loss of our natural heritage, essentially. And a loss of a service that they provide, which is eating a lot of those invasive bugs and pests around people's farm areas. So what really is causing these declines, we don't quite know. We have an idea, which is typically it's habitat loss. That's usually the #1 cause of bird declines, habitat loss. In Indiana alone, from 1950 to 1980, the amount of open pasture land decreased by 53%, and that's what they rely on, is this open pasture land. That pasture land was converted to row crop production. And this was already at the time where they were on their downward trajectory of declining around 4.8% per year. So the average farm size also increased by 64%, which was likely the result of farming intensification. So you ended up going from these really nice small farms to family farms to these big commercial farms. And clean farming practices were adopted, meaning hedgerows, things like all those vegetation that grows along fences were removed. Those areas are really primary nesting habitat for shrikes. So they were losing a lot of their habitat, not just for foraging, but also for nesting. Pesticides are also a threat. Not only does it perhaps interfere with their physiology, perhaps it might make them lethargic, have these sublethal effects affecting their behavior, but it also completely kills the prey base that they depend on, which are insects. That's what they need, such as like grasshoppers and beetles. Declines in shrikes actually coincided very well with the use of organochlorines like DDT from 1940 to 1970. But they still are they're still struggling for some reason. There have been studies that are looking more at neonicotinoids and seeing what high exposure to those pesticides are causing. Like, are there any sort of behavioral effects or something like that, or reproductive effects that are leading to them not being able to reproduce as well. Also, shrikes are really susceptible to collisions with vehicles. They love to fly really low over the roads, unfortunately, because that's how they hunt. They go from a perch that's about, I'd say 4 or 5 feet high, maybe as tall as 10 feet high if it's like a tree. And then they fly really low to hunt on bare ground. So oftentimes they're hunting right along roadsides and get hit by cars. And finally, scientists, because shrikes are such a weird species, they are really interesting and weird species. They occupy a whole variety of different habitats, and may therefore have a whole variety of different threats in each type of habitat. We don't have enough understanding of what actually is threatening them locally, what may be threatening them on their stopover sites, where when they're migrating, they have to stop over somewhere to refuel, or on their wintering grounds, which is where they spend a lot of their time if they are migratory birds. And this is what I alluded to before, which is full annual cycle conservation. This is what we need to really focus on with birds, is trying to conserve them through their whole entire lives rather than just when they're here, which is when they're just breeding. We need to be able to focus our conservation efforts on their whole life. Because if they're getting whacked, perhaps in Central America, we'll see declines here, but we won't be able to resolve them. Ultimately, we have nothing that we can do until we find out how we can, contribute to that. But we need to know more. And so, what is Indiana actually doing to conserve loggerhead shrikes? You might be thinking. Well, it's a big partner effort. We actually began in earnest to monitor and ban shrikes with small color grants that are placed around their legs. And this began in 2014. And then we've been slowly amping up our efforts to ban and monitor them year after year. And now we have one of the most comprehensive field data sets on the movements, breeding, and productivity of shrikes in a single location in the eastern United States. And then through years of monitoring, we've noticed that shrikes commonly use eastern red cedars for nesting, especially early on in the breeding season when trees are not foliated, they don't have leaves on them. So they need air, or rather deciduous trees don't have leaves on them. They specifically focus on those evergreens because it gives them the cover for their nests so that predators don't see their nests and want to eat them. So we've noticed that they like the cedars, but landowners don't like them because they're weedy. Eastern red cedars are super weedy along fences, not only because it's really hard to maintain a fence if you got this huge tree growing in the middle of it, but it also shades out area that could be potentially used to grow more corn or soy or vegetables for your family. And so as a result, they're removing it. And so these safe nesting spots for shrikes are disappearing. So what have we done? This is the official It Takes a Village message. In 2019, we partnered up with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and the Indiana Audubon Society to work with landowners on private property to preserve, or rather plant and preserve 8-foot-tall native eastern red cedars in known territories of loggerhead shrikes to provide those safe nesting locations for them. And this is what it took. So I wanted to show you this slide specifically, not to like freak you out, but to show you how much effort was involved and all the different groups that were involved to make this program successful. So this partnership actually is able to it gets money from 4 different pots of money. So funding occurs from 4 different pots of money. We have, in the Indiana DNR, we have a private lands program where we use hunting license dollars to be able to provide a signing incentive for landowners to want to actually plant eastern red cedars on their properties so that they have safe nesting spots for shrikes. And then we have another partner, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, who provide the contract to have the landowner sign and say, I promise to conserve these trees for 10 years at least. And when they sign that contract, Partners for Fish and Wildlife are on board and will then help pay to plant and preserve these cedars as well. So they provide some funds to these plants. We also have the nongame wildlife fund, which is the program that is used for matching my federal money that I use. It's based completely off of donations, and that's used to buy the bushes itself. So really, the money was for buying the bushes, planting the bushes, buying fences to go around the bushes to protect them from livestock, because we realize that livestock love to rub up against them and eat them, depending on the type of livestock. Cows love it. Sheep, not so much. Goats definitely will eat. They eat everything. And maybe chickens. I think we have chickens on some of our farms, but horses too. But we realized we needed to protect them. As well as providing incentives for the landowners to really value the cedar bushes as something that is a positive perception of those bushes rather than something negative. Something that's giving them money rather than just being a weed. We wanted to change those landowner perspectives on eastern red cedars. The other super important partner that made this successful was the Indiana Audubon Society. I actually proposed to them an Adopt a Shrike program that would provide some funds to help allow us to spend our money more flexibly. So they were there to, if we forgot something like the fences, we didn't realize we needed fences until they started eating the bushes. They swooped in and helped us pay for the fences and then help install those, which was great. So they've been very important for making it a success. And they've also been there to help us provide annual incentives to the landowners, albeit just something small. So again, to help these landowners better perceive eastern red cedars as something valuable rather than a big annoying weed. So that was what all was involved to get 4 eastern red cedar bushes planted on landowner properties in loggerhead shrike territories. Just to talk a little bit more about the Adopt a Shrike program. So to become an adopter, you pay, I think the person pays $50 and they adopt a color banded shrike, which we actually give people updates on their individual shrike. So every year you'll receive an update that says, we found your shrike or we've not found your shrike. It depends on which shrike you end up getting. My shrike that I adopted was unfortunately a first-year male and he was never resighted afterwards, but I'll have to just adopt another one. You receive a certificate and all those updates as well as a t-shirt, and then that money is put towards specifically preserving those bushes in these territories. And so far 160 adoptions have been made through Indiana Audubon, and 25 of those dollars go towards specifically the Shrubs for Shrikes program, and they've accumulated $4,000 dedicated to that program, which has been great. So what happened after we started planting all these bushes? Well, we actually had some success, which like totally blew my mind because I didn't expect this to happen so soon. So in late May 2020, we planted 46 cedar bushes on 12 different properties in these territories. And by June, shrikes actually born that year were using the cedar bushes to hide in, to protect themselves from predators, and to use for perching and hunting from. And so we've continued to plant the bushes because they seem to like them. They seem to use them a lot. And since then, we've added 24 more bushes planted on 6 other private properties in, again, shrike territories. And this summer, we actually observed a shrike nest in a cedar planted in 2020 in Orange County. And she actually successfully raised 3 chicks, which was great. I was like, finally, at least one thing happened. So this was the first shrike nest we actually have found in a planted cedar. That was the whole purpose of the program, was to plant these bushes to be safe places for them to nest. And this one at least was. And 3 fledglings survived to the point where we actually captured them, banded them, and are still hanging out and getting fed by their parents right now. So it's been great. And similar to previous years, we've noticed that the young shrikes are continuing to use these bushes for shelter so that they can be safe from predators. And they also use the top of the bushes to perch from and practice their singing because, attracting a mate takes practice, especially when you're young. Plus the adults use them to as singing perches. So it helps them to enhance, like, this is my territory, look at me, like, I'm a very valuable male or female, So that first successful nest has been a really great sign of hope for our program and for the species in the years to come. We're very excited about that. So that's the Loggerhead Shrike program. I will quickly go through this because my time's going pretty fast. So I just wanted to talk about Motus because I just want people to just know what this is. A lot of people, so like in the conservation community, there's been some talk about Motus, which is this awesome wildlife tracking network. It's a very like grassroots program where it's a bunch of different partners that get together, put up these stations, they're remote stations that help to detect whether animal that has a tag on it comes by. So these stations are set up throughout the entire world, and it's getting more popular. They have them in Europe and Asia, all on their own frequencies, but North America is probably the biggest hub for Motus. And the power of it is that you're able to track animals flying typically, or rather migrating wildlife that are very small. So we are able to use these tags to put on things like warblers, which are just a few ounces, plus even bats, as well as monarch butterflies. And I think they've been actually using them on whatchamacallit? Oh goodness, I'm gonna say odonates, which is not, I'm just blanking out on that, but another type of insect. So they have been so miniaturized to be able to even track the migration of monarch butterflies, which is kind of crazy to think that you have technology that's that small. So Motus, that's the power of Motus, is that you can put these tags on things that are super small. And the current, I'd say the current hindrance in being able to track animals that fly is the amount of weight the tag, how much the tag weighs. And the battery is usually what takes up the most of the weight. So to actually get some good data, you have to have a big tag. So it's easy to track like waterfowl, big birds that can handle the tags, but it's very difficult to put them on little itty bitty guys like warblers. So that's why it's particularly of interest right now. And ultimately, the data that you end up getting from the Motus network is that it helps identify major migratory stopover sites, at least in Indiana, rather across the entire network. But for me, it helps to identify those major migratory stopovers, as well as the pathways, so that we can focus our efforts more on conserving and preserving those areas for birds and our rare and state endangered species. So as a result, there was an opportunity that I just jumped onto, which was the Indiana DNR ended up partnering with the Missouri Department of Conservation, which is their state agency that regulates wildlife. And we submitted a grant proposal with a whole bunch of other states called Broadening the Motus Wildlife Tracking Network in the Midwest and the Neotropics. So we ended up getting federal money to expand the Motus network through 6 states in the Midwest, which are Missouri, Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, as well as in 3 countries, Costa Rica, Yucatan, and Mexico, and Colombia. And then funds were also there to contribute to projects that affected our state listed species like golden winged warblers. So there was specifically tags in the budget to put on golden winged warblers, both on their wintering grounds, and as well as their breeding grounds. And then there's another project that was put in as well that focuses on American kestrels, because very little is known about them and they're experiencing pretty precipitous declines. They're not listed in Indiana, but I think it might be time for that, but we'll see. So what I ended up doing overall this past year to help enhance our network and fulfill my objectives for this grant was I put up 6 stations so far. I have 2 more to put up. And those are specifically around, I wanted to put them up around the Lake Michigan area because birds, and perhaps bats too, will use water bodies as a way of guiding them through their migratory journeys, guiding them down south. And so usually they'll use the edges of the lakes, the large Great Lakes, to help them navigate down south, and they'll end up kind of funneling at that southern tip, which is right in Indiana, and we could put a whole bunch of Motus stations along that edge to pick those birds up. So I strategically placed them there to pick up birds migrating south that use that as a migratory pathway. I also wanted to focus on other public properties like Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area, which is like a birding mecca. A lot of birds stop over there during migration, and a lot of different birds breed there, like our bitterns and things like that, as well as Hovey Lake, which is at the confluence of the Wabash River and the Ohio River. And so that helps to cover again that migratory pathway. Hopefully we'll catch birds that are either, if they're migrating along the Wabash River, we can pick them up, or if they're migrating along the Ohio River, we can pick them up. So it just kind of enhances our ability to detect these birds that have tags on them. Let's see, so I wanted to put them up in a mosaic of habitats. Mostly they're on wetland properties, mainly because those are the areas that we manage. But hopefully I'll get at other more upland species as well. And these are the photos of the antennas that were installed, and each one of them are associated with a sensor station, which is our receiving device that says, hey, a bird came by. And they range up to each station on the, I'm gonna get a little techie, 166 frequencies. So you know how our radios, we can tune them in on different frequencies? That's like the same thing. All those physics rules apply. It's the same exact thing. So there's frequencies going all around us right now. And all these radio signals going on around us right now that are on different frequencies. And so this specific frequency that all the birds are tagged on are on the 166. And it's called very high frequency, it's VHF. That birds that are tagged with that frequency can interact with antennas on those buildings that are big. They're like about 10 feet long, and those antennas can have a detection range of around 12 kilometers, so like 50 miles in one direction. So for the Hovey Lake station, which I'll show you down here, that actually goes all the way across here and all the way across here. So it's a huge range. Just imagine like 12 miles in both directions, that it can, any bird that's within that little fence, I guess you could say, of detection range will be picked up. So fingers crossed we get something. And yeah, that's really it for the Motus project. I'm kind of trying to help with efforts to expand the project throughout Indiana. And like I said, it takes a village. So really, ultimately, what we're doing with this work is trying to figure out where best to conserve these species so that we can grow more chicks. Ultimately, it's all about growing more chicks. And this is what's contributing to it. And it's a lot of people working together. So that's why I wanted to talk about that pretty quickly. So that's it for me. All my work is funded by the Non-Game Wildlife Fund plus our federal money, which is, it's our federal match. We end up using this money to get federal money. So it's donations used to get money from our federal government. And really what it does is prove that, hey, people are actually really interested in the work that we do. And that means that, okay, we can earn it. We can earn your federal money because people really, really support us in all the work that we've been doing. So that's what the Non-Game Fund is all about, is telling the federal government that we are worthy of their federal money because the citizens of Indiana are really interested in it because they donate their money that they've earned through their hard labor to us. So, and that's what the Non-Game Wildlife Fund is. So this presentation was funded by that. And that's it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Allisyn. That was really fascinating. Very cool. It's crazy to think how small those trackers must be, but technology is progressing so quickly around us. Okay, so now we'll move on to the question and answer session portion of our lecture today. So you guys are all welcome to put questions you have for Allisyn in the chat. I received a few ahead of time, so I will just start with those. And also you're welcome to unmute yourself or turn on your video. That makes it feel a little bit more like a conversation. So feel free to do that, or if you prefer, just type your questions into the comments and I will read them aloud. So first question that we received early would be, Allisyn, is there a species of bird that you hold most dear and why?
Yes, that's always a hard question for me because I love a lot of birds. But overall, I say a group. I have a group that I really love working with, and that's the icterids. So those are all the blackbirds. I did my master's thesis on red-winged blackbirds and looked at mercury accumulation in red-winged blackbirds in an urban setting as well as a suburban area to compare their exposure to mercury. And they are very easy to handle. They're very good in the hand. And then I worked on bobolinks after that. And I love bobolinks. They're a really fun species. They're just, to describe them, if you don't know what a bobolink is, they look like they're wearing a tuxedo, but backwards. And they have this big yellow, like puffy afro. They're very cute. And they sound like a robot. So they're really fun. If I had to choose among the icterids, I say the bobolinks are my favorite because they're very endearing. They're very cute and easy to work with as well.
Very cool. Gotta work that one up. So we have a question from Art. What is the best week or month to visit Jasper Pulaski to see the cranes?
I recommend November. November is probably the best because I've noticed, so crane migration has become further and further pushed later on in the year because our winters are becoming milder. And so birds are not feeling as obligated to, at least the cranes, are not as obligated to leave their breeding grounds until they're pushed by bad weather. And so we've been noticing peak numbers in migration has been going further into the calendar year. So November, it used to be October, it's now November. So I highly recommend going there in November. And you can see several thousands of cranes in a night.
Exciting, that's on my list now. So we have a question from Mary Wells, our wonderful education director at Sycamore Land Trust. And she asks, what are the most important steps that Hoosiers can take to support bird biodiversity and population size?
Yeah, absolutely. So every individual can help. I strongly believe that everybody can contribute. And it's through things like providing habitat in your yards. If you own a space, you have a house and you're fed up with your lawn, it's okay to get rid of it. That's totally fine. Plant native habitat. That's super important. We've noticed that it actually attracts greater biodiversity of pollinators than areas that are perhaps like more pristine because people are actively managing them to have a large diversity of plants, of native plants. So planting native species is really important around your yard. I'd say, and the wonderful thing about doing that, which I really loved, is that you get to observe the natural behaviors of birds when they're foraging and interacting with each other when you have those native plants that they're feeding off of. And bird feeders are great too. They're definitely great, but you don't get to see that really cool interaction of, for example, I saw a cardinal hanging out on my bottle brush grass, just picking at the bottle brush grass, and I had no clue that they ate the seeds from bottle brush grass. That was super cool to observe. And it was just a cardinal. I was just like, that's awesome. I'm glad that they're eating it. And just seeing, you know, all the different types of things that they eat. And how, yeah, they interact with all these different things. Sometimes they like flutter over certain flower heads and just like pick at insects, or they'll like land on it or like hang around, like especially with sunflower heads, they're super heavy. So you get goldfinches just like underneath, upside down, eating at sunflower seeds, which is really fun to watch. You can't get that with a bird feeder. And that's another thing that I really enjoy. Another thing you can do is clean your bird feeders. If you do feed birds, clean them. That is probably one of the biggest it's a threats to birds that do come to feeders, is getting sick from the bird seed if it hasn't been cleaned. And I recommend, when it comes to cleaning, a 10% bleach solution, so like 9 parts water, like 9 cups of water to 1 part or 1 cup of bleach. Having that solution, scrubbing out all the debris first instead of just dunking it in. You got to scrub everything out, and then dunk it in, help and disinfect, and then wash off all that bleach solution completely, and then let it air dry completely, because you don't want water in there if you're going to put seed, because it'll get moldy. So just practicing these really good, I'd say, best practices for managing your bird feeders, and that includes hummingbird feeders. I would recommend once a month at least to clean bird feeders, seed bird feeders. When it comes to hummingbird feeders, since it's sugar water, I recommend once every 3 to 5 days, especially in the hot summers. I keep them up. I like feeding birds too. But I just make sure if it's got a white mold growing in it, it floats in the solution, that's bad. Take it down. They do get sick, and sometimes they will die because of it. And I do get calls of people who are like, I had 5 hummingbirds die. What's happening? I'm like, do you feed the hummingbirds? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, when was the last time you actually, replenished the solution? They're like, oh, maybe like a month ago. I'm like, oh, okay, that's probably what's going on. So they do, yeah, you just have to be really good about that. Last one, big one, is preventing window collisions. A lot of, like, majority of, so the second largest human direct cause of bird deaths is from collisions. And oftentimes it's not just like with wind energy or anything like that. It's actually with people's windows on their houses. So there are these things called, there are like ways to make your house bird safe. There's a thing called Zen curtains, which I like to, we put them up, they're just lines. I could actually show, we have them around our office. I put them up recently, and they're just these little lines that like flow in the wind. And it just says that this is a window and it's not more outdoor area, because birds mistake windows for space. They think it's just more space, so they fly directly full speed into them, and that's how they die. So making sure that your windows are covered, and it has to be, a lot of people think that just putting your blinds down or your curtains, closing your curtains is enough. It has to be on the outside of the window, because you have to break up the reflection. So just doing on the inside will not do it. Has to be on the outside. So just, I'd say, look it up, preventing bird window collisions at your house. And there are tons of different solutions that can be really, really cheap. So those are the 3 things.
It's very inspiring. Chris Fox, our land stewardship director at Sycamore Land Trust, just wanted to comment that we have Zen curtains at Cedar Crest, which is Sycamore Land Trust's office in Bloomington.
Awesome.
And we've been doing a lot there to prevent collisions with the very large, wonderful windows we have.
They're beautiful. They're
yes,
beautiful.
but unfortunate in some ways. So Art has another great question / comment. According to the books, the great gray owl lives in Canada and only rarely comes down this far south, but we think we have twice heard one along the creek behind our house. It's a distinctive call.
Yes, I don't know much about great gray owls. I would venture to guess that there's an excellent birding ID. It's called Merlin, and it's an app that you can download and use to help identify songs of birds. And what I recommend is using that app, just opening it up, and it'll show you a list of all of the birds that it's hearing in real time, and it'll tell you whether it's that species or not. So strongly recommend that. Since I can't hear it, I can't determine, but I just recommend like either get a recording or use that app.
And that's the Merlin app, MERLIN.
Yep. Like the bird and the wizard. Both great things.
So we have a question in the comments from Cheryl. Is there any study concerning meadowlarks? What is there in Freetown, Indiana that has one of the antennae?
Okay, yes. So there are, so I've worked recently on eastern meadowlarks. We've been tagging them with satellite transmitters because they are a bulky bird. they're a pretty chunky bird. And so they can handle satellite transmitters that, and if, let me see if I could, they can handle really long satellite transmitters. And that will give us, since it's a satellite transmitter, their location every day. And it's sent to a computer. So it's like hands off, super easy. Once you get them on, you don't have to worry about it. You get those data every day as to where that bird is located. So you can very easily track migratory movements. So that's the work that we've been doing so far, is just working with, it's called the Central Hardwoods Joint Venture. It's a partnership between state agencies, nonprofits, and universities to best preserve the Central Hardwoods, which is like the southern part, all of our hardwoods, Hoosier National Forest of that specific bird conservation region. So that's pretty much all the Eastern Meadowlark work that we've been doing, is just trying to better understand where they're going, because very little work has been done on actually studying their migratory movements. Regarding the Freetown, Indiana site, that's one of our private property owners. So we actually have a ham radio guy who's been helping us. We have 2 ham radio people, which has been great because they know gobs about communications and a lot more than I do. And they've been helping me try to figure out how to deal with Motus, because it's all just communications technology. So they have been wonderful in erecting their own towers pro bono, which is amazing. One of our guys from Raptors Rise, that rehabilitator, actually put up a crane, put up a drone tower, which is like those typical towers that you see on a whole bunch of people's houses that put like an antenna on it for TV, for example. That was done. He bought the tower, he got the crane to install the tower, and he got all the concrete to fit it in, as well as had all the devices to help ground the wiring, because if it gets hit by lightning, that's very bad. So he had all that knowledge and did it himself, and all I had to do was provide him the antennas and the sensor station. So that the person in Freetown is similar to him. He'll be putting up his own tower, and I'll just give him the materials so that we can enhance our network. Yeah.
Okay, I have a few more questions for you if you're okay with staying on a little bit longer with us. Okay, these were supplied ahead of time. Do you have any bucket list bird sightings or other ornithology goals that you have yet to accomplish? We'd love to hear about that.
Yes.
You've done so much, but what have you not done?
Bird sightings. I'm actually, so I don't, majority of my birding is around my house. I actually don't go far when I go birding. I like to stay around my house. I like to be, I just like, it's nice and comfortable. I love being outside. That's my favorite thing to do. It's just be outside in the garden and walk around on the beeline. That's where I live around. And just become extremely familiar with the birds in my area. I think it's extra special just because I can identify who's who, rather than like seeing a bird and never seeing them again. So I don't really have a bucket list for any specific bird species. I don't really chase birds when there's like a really rare bird that comes around. I'm just like, okay, that's fine. I keep lists just because it contributes to bird conservation, because eBird is this app where you can submit your sightings. And that's used to study birds and help better conserve them. So yeah, I don't have any bucket list. But regarding my specific goals for Indiana, I ultimately would love to have this big network of partners to collectively focus on state listed species. So species that are endangered mostly. Also ones that are of special concern, meaning we don't know very much about them or they're rare. And do it in a way that it would be called the Indiana Bird Conservation Initiative, where we all work together to delist species. So everybody gets their species that they're really interested in and just has at it, but we can cooperate and like collectively make it all work out, because it takes a village. So that's the big goal that I have in mind. I don't know if it'll come to fruition, but I've been thinking about it for a long time.
We will keep our fingers crossed. That's sounds really important. Okay, so this question comes from us here at Sycamore Land Trust. We're curious, what made you decide to pursue ornithology as a career, and what training did you complete to get here?
Sure. I grew up in New Jersey in the suburbs, so I was not an outdoor person at all, just to give you some basis. That was my baseline. I got really interested in it because I went to university, and there was one professor who got me really into birds. She gave me those opportunities that I needed. I originally wanted to be a doctor, and then I changed to a vet because I love animals. And then I decided, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't want to work with just dogs and cats and things like that. I want to work on conserving wildlife. I love diversity. I love being outside. And so I went and took a class in ornithology and started speaking with their professor, Julie Lockwood at Rutgers. And she got me my first field job in the Everglades, which was a perfect opportunity. So that was my introduction to birds, was the Florida Everglades, which is amazing. It's like extremely biodiverse site. So it ends up being like a really great portal to the birding world. And then I handled my first bird, and I was just like, I'm sold. I'm sold. I'm going to do it for the rest of my life. So I've had field jobs after field jobs ever since then. And I got my master's working on red-winged blackbirds, looking at mercury levels. And then after that, I was working on my PhD, but chose not to finish. It was on Galapagos hawks. Actually tagged them with transmitters to look at their social behaviors and to see how it would inform their sharing of ectoparasites, specifically feather lice. It was very focused. It was very niche-like. So I decided to not continue with that because I thought I was getting too deep into academia in a certain subject, and I wanted to be more applied. I wanted to conserve birds now. And so I stopped and left with my master's, and then I became a middle school science teacher for 2 years. I worked for Teach for America and worked in the St. Louis public schools. And then after that, came here for the job. So I was like, teaching is a lot. Whoever is a elementary school teacher or a high school teacher, props to you, because it is a hard job. I would much rather be an ornithologist covering the state than having to do that much work. It is a challenging job. Grading and just like tons of kids that you just have to take under your wing, and you have to just value all of them equally. It's so hard. So yeah, it wasn't for me. So I give a lot of credit to teachers. They need more resources for sure. But yep.
Certainly agree with that. My daughter is in first grade. I do not know how her teacher does it, but she gives so much love to those kids. Okay, so we have another question in the comment from Chris Fox, our land stewardship director. Is there much research going on with the nightjar species, such as whippoorwills? These species seem to experience severe declines, but because they are more nocturnal, they seem less often mentioned.
Yes.
Great question.
Yes. So the whippoorwills, there have been work on whippoorwills. I believe Indiana Audubon Society is actually working on them, and they're using Motus to tag them. So Libby Keys, she's the land manager at their Marygrave Bird Sanctuary. She is tagging whippoorwills, and I think it contributes to a much bigger study. There's a guy in Illinois, the Illinois Natural History Museum, Illinois Natural History Survey. Mike Ward is the guy. He's the one that I know most for Eastern whippoorwill work. And he's got some really interesting findings. One of which that I remember best was that Eastern whippoorwills tend to be most active during full moons. And the reason why they figured out was that because moth capture is I guess moth activity is at its greatest during a full moon. And so they have this ability to kind of be in sync with those full moon events so that they can enhance their ability to, or rather maximize their ability to consume as many moths as they can all at once until their next full moon cycle. So that's really fascinating work that's been going on. I think there's been some more work done regarding trying to look at managing forests for whippoorwills. Not too sure where that's headed, but I know there's a professor at Purdue who is trying to get some work done at the hardwood ecosystem experiment, which is pretty close to here. It's in Morgan Monroe State Forest, I think. Yeah, one of those. And it would specifically focus on seeing whether forests that are managed at a younger age, so like early, we call it young forest, is beneficial to whippoorwills. So that's what I know so far. But definitely, if you're really interested, talk to Mike Ward. I would love to get him to come to Indiana and tag a whole bunch of whippoorwills here just to see where they're coming from. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're curious too.
Yeah.
Okay, so last call for questions. Anybody have a question, please stand forward. Oh, go ahead, Margaret.
I have a question, or actually an observation about loggerhead shrikes. The only time that I have ever seen a loggerhead shrike was in southern Georgia, and it was perched on a utility wire outside of a big prison. And I had never, until your talk today, made the association between barbed wire and loggerhead shrikes. But that might be a good place to try to observe them.
Yeah, that is a great idea. I would have never thought. They've got the short grass because it's mowed often, plus the impaling sites, as well as these high perches. It would just be like the nesting habitat would be the thing that I would be most, I would look for. But cool, very cool. That's very interesting. Great comment.
Great. So let's close this out with one last question. I'm curious, what is the weirdest or coolest fact about Indiana birds that you've learned in your career?
Okay, well, Indiana birds, okay, let's see. Well, I know a lot of cool facts, about birds in general. So fun fact would be vultures will regurgitate all of their stomach when they're threatened. They just barf as a way of protecting themselves. So if something comes up on them, startles them, they'll just throw up on you. And it's because their stomachs are highly acidic. So vultures are wonderful species because they are, I would consider them the janitors of our environment. They're there to help clean up dead roadkill, any carcasses that carry disease, and could potentially threaten our human health and lives, so that they can, when they eat it, surprisingly, that acidity in their stomach has the ability to kill all those agents that cause infection. So that's another group of animals that I really enjoy, vultures, just because they do provide that service for us. And they're underdogs. People are always like, oh, vultures, oh, that must be an ominous sight. I'm like, no, they're fine. They're just cleaning up after us. Another fun fact, woodpeckers, they actually have their tongues extend all the way behind their skulls here, all the way in the back. They have like a kind of like this space that is dedicated for their tongues, because their tongues have to be long enough to be able to go into the hole to extract insects. And their tongues are barbed in a way that helps to grab at the insects. It's barbed backwards, so it's like, imagine this is the tip of the tongue. The tongue's barb would be facing towards, or pushing out towards the body, so that when it pulls it out and pulls out the insects, they kind of get grasped onto and have to get pulled out. And that actually is it provides both that ability to have much extra space for their tongue to eat, plus it provides cushion for them when they're drumming on trees. So it's like having a pillow behind on your skull. Just like, so they don't get concussions every time they drum. So second fun fact. Oh yeah, there you go. I got the vultures pee down their legs too when hot.
Yeah, Susan, our administrative director of Sycamore Land Trust, says vultures are awesome birds and that they pee down their legs when hot.
Yeah.
So very cool. Well, my goodness, Alli, that was really fantastic. I learned a lot, very inspiring. And that wraps up our evening. We can't thank you enough for joining us and for all your work, everything you do to support birds.
Thank you.
Have
It's a
great
pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Take care, everybody.
Alli, that was so good. Thank you.
Excellent.
What a treasure for our virtual lecture collection.
Yeah.
Oh, there's Susan, our administrative director.
Hello.
Oh, yeah. Our
Thank
whole
you so
team-
much, Alli. That was so good.
Good. I
Yeah,
hope
our
you
whole
liked
team-
it.
Our whole team was really excited about this one. So thank
It's a
you.
lot of information. That's all. It's like pack, lots of information. So
But you're really good at explaining it for
yeah.
Yeah, you did a great job.
lay
Excellent.
people like me. I actually was following you the whole time.
Yeah. Good.
Getting my brain expanded. So thank you
My
for that.
middle school science teaching. That's really what helped. It really did help me. Like I had to translate everything down to 6th to 8th grade. So I think it's so important like that everybody has that ability to do that. Because it's like everybody comes from different backgrounds.
Mhm.
So when I learn about communication stuff, I'm just like, I don't know what you're talking about. You need to really get it down to an elementary level for me. Seriously, like radio waves. I can't envision what they look like, but just tell me what to do.
Yeah, that's the best.